strange studies of strange stories.
With a roar and a howl, the thing was upon us, out of total darkness. Involuntarily, I drew back as its headlights passed, and every object in the little room rattled from the reverberations. Then the power car was by, and there was only the clackety-clack, clackety-clack of wheels and lighted windows, flickering past like bits of film on a badly connected projection machine. I caught glimpses of occupants briefly, bleak-eyed men sitting miserably on hard benches, a pair of lovers oblivious to the hour's lateness, and all else. Conductors here and there, too, their uniforms black splotches against the blaze of car lights. Then, red-tailed lamps shot by, and the roar died to an earthquake rumble far down the track. "The 3-1 Express," my friend said quietly. "From the battery. On time to the minute, too. It's the last, you know. Until nearly dawn."
Those opening lines were from the Robert Barbour Johnson story, Far Below. And just like that train car, with a roar and a howl, we are upon you to discuss it.
Welcome to Strange Studies of Strange Stories. I'm Chris Lack.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer. Welcome to our free episode for the month of August. This month, we didn't want to stick to any specific genre. We just sort of shook the story purse out onto the table and picked 4 that have come up a few times over the years. Nevertheless, a sort of mutant theme formed out of nowhere. So I'm just going to call this month August Aberrations. This story came up a lot recently when we covered Amina in Monster May, that story about a mama ghoul and her cubs, because this one is also a ghoul story. And I'm not spoiling anything, because if you want to read this in Weird Tales, there's an illustration right at the top of the page with a bunch of police in the subway fighting it out with a batch of ghouls. It reads, "A weird tale of the New York subway and horrible things with dead white eyes that burrow up beneath the unsuspecting city."
Ooh.
This story appeared in Weird Tales in the summer of 1939 and actually references Amina at one point. More importantly, was written as a riff on one of Lovecraft's most famous stories. I'm talking, of course, about Pickman's Model. However, despite being an exploration of the same monsters and themes as the Lovecraft story, and told in the same sort of testimonial style, it stands as its own story, I think, rather than falling into the category of pastiche or imitation. I'm not alone in that analysis of it. Readers of Weird Tales voted it to be the best story ever published in the magazine in a 1953 poll.
Wow.
So based on that high praise, it was high time for us to cover it. It's also high time we brought on this episode's reader, I say. Will you please identify this creature?
Our reader is Rick Sandage. He's the game master for the Find the Path podcast, a Pathfinder RPG gaming group that has recorded their playthroughs of Pathfinder Adventure Paths for years. They have well-produced stories ranging from fighting undead in desert tombs to noble court intrigue and rebelling against a fiendish tyrannical government. You can check them out at find-path.com or by searching for Find the Path podcast.
We'll also link out in the show notes. This is the first time the show has featured Robert Barbour Johnson. What do we know about this cat?
He was born in 1907 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Like many of us, he got into Weird Tales as a teenager.
His family was involved in the railroads, so undoubtedly that influenced this story. Johnson's father worked his way up to become part of the railroad's undercover police service. His dear old pop was a railroad cop.
Johnson moved to New Orleans when he was a young adult and worked at the New Orleans Item. He also wrote detective and horror stories for pulp magazines under pseudonyms. Another side hustle of his was as a press agent for a traveling circus. And while doing that, he got into animal training, specifically big cats. He got involved with the New York-based circus full-time, but the Depression made it hard to make a living.
Well, the big cats had to take side jobs in that era as well. It was tough on everybody.
In the 1930s, Johnson moved to San Francisco, where he eventually became friends with Clark Ashton Smith and his wife, but also Anton LaVey.
The Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, who was a circus guy too, so it makes sense, or a carny. It must have been much later, because LaVey was born in 1930.
Yeah.
So this was probably in the 60s. LaVey was, before he became famous for the Satanic Bible, he was like a kooky local San Francisco celebrity, and he had a pet black leopard named Zoltan. that he would walk around town on a leash. So he and Johnson probably bonded over that. They were both Tiger Kings.
In 1935, after reading Johnson's story, Lead Soldiers, Lovecraft wrote Johnson a fan letter. Johnson, in turn, wrote this story, riffing on, of course, Pickman's model. Johnson served in World War II in an artillery unit. After the war, he went under contract with Blue Book to write 6 circus stories a year. I guess circus fiction is a niche? He was not only a writer, but he was also an exceptional painter. I was hoping when I looked at his work for some scary monster stuff, but no, it was circus stuff.
Circus stuff, of course.
Yeah.
That was the heyday of the circus. It's relegated to something a little down market now.
Sure.
But at that time, it was a dominant form of entertainment in America, at least. When the circus came to town, they would let school out, businesses would close. It was a holiday.
Wow.
You'd want to be out there and see all the animals and performers parade into town. It makes sense that there would be a lot of writing around the personalities involved, just as much as there is now ink shed on Hollywood, I imagine.
Johnson died on Boxing Day in 1987 at the age of 80.
I like to imagine that on that day, he motioned to a loved one from his deathbed, and they leaned in close to hear his last words, and then he nailed him with the squirting flour. Just a last squirt for his circus brothers and sisters. And then he died. Passed on, and the flower instantly wilts.
This story, Far Below, is his most famous. This might be the first story that used Lovecraft and his writings as a source for something that is real. Let's stop talking around it and just dig down into this story, Far Below. It begins in a small room filled with equipment deep under New York City, part of the subway system. The narrator is there with his buddy, Inspector Craig.
What an opening line. With the roar and a howl, the thing was upon us out of total darkness. It's about the train car flying by, but I don't want to blow your mind. It also suggests some monstery hijinks.
What?
I also loved the description for the subway map in the room. That great black board on which a luminous worm seemed to crawl. The map is actually lighting up, charting the progress of the subway train, which wouldn't really be a big deal to us now, but is kind of incredible technology for this era. Inspector Craig says it's not just a chart, it actually records invisible lights, the sort of things that open speakeasy doors and rich men's garages. Pairs of them spaced approximately every 25 yards along 5 miles of subway tunnel. I don't dare think what it cost to install.
Craig is the head of this special detail, which started patrolling the subway tunnels all the way back during World War I. There was a train accident that was blamed on a German spy, but that's not what happened. If people really knew what happened, they would flip out. They'd go mad if they knew what was down here, far below.
It's implied that this is why the mayor funded these expensive sensors that track the train, because there is a great threat here far below that must be contained.
Inspector Craig says that he's not sure how he and his men actually mentally deal with the threat that they face. He thinks it's because they just get on with their job, they don't really talk about what they're doing or what it actually means. I think if we ever really did let our minds go to brooding on what they are, it would be all over for us. Human flesh and blood couldn't stand it,
Right away, he hits on one of the story's main themes, which is not talking about or acknowledging things as a means of dealing with them. We never quite define the things in our own minds objectively. We just sort of let things hang in the air, you might say. We don't speak of what we're guarding against by name. We just call it them. Or one of them,
Craig says that beyond 120th Street, the tunnels are pretty safe. The creatures are confined to a particular stretch of tunnel due to habitual behavior or supernatural reasons. Some sort of mystic laws?
Right away, he throws down some Lovecraft lingo. Or maybe it's just the awful dankness of the tunnel here. The fungoid moisture and miasmic darkness that suits them. At all events, they don't come up anywhere else except along this stretch.
It might have to do with this location and the extreme depth of the tunnel, or the fact that it's close to the East River. He doesn't know. But that's why he and his special detail are here. And the special detail is equipped. They've got lights, patrol cars, and stations like the one that they're in now. 10 men are on duty at all times, so this stuff is serious. He then tells the narrator about some of his men losing their minds. One guy, they lost him out in the tunnel for a few days. They found him. His eyes were all shiny like theirs. When we finally ran him down, we killed him. Just like that. No bones about it. Put, put, put. And that was the end. Though they wear police uniforms, they aren't subject to the ordinary rules of the police. So killing of something other is permitted, even if it used to be a person. Craig explains that he used to be a professor at the Natural History Museum. He was hired on after the train accident he referenced before because of his expertise. Primates in Africa.
They needed an expert because they'd found a thing in the wreckage, this wreck that happened, within a year of the tunnel opening. They'd found it pinned down in the wreckage, screaming in agony from their lights on its dead white eyeballs. Indeed, it seemed to have died from the lights as much as anything else. Organically, it was sound enough, save for a broken bone or two.
They didn't know what this thing was and thought maybe it was an ape, and that's why they called in Craig. He examined the creature for 6 days and nights, barely resting.
Of course, long before that, I had told them the thing wasn't an ape. There was vaguely anthropoid structure, all right, and the blood corpuscles were almost human. Quite shockingly so. But the head, and the spade-like appendages, and the muscular development were quite unlike any beast or man of this earth. Indeed, the thing had never been on this earth. There was no doubt of that. It would have died above ground in half a minute, just like an angleworm in the sun. And I'm afraid my report to the authorities didn't help them much. After all, even a fellow scientist would have found it a bit difficult to reconcile my classifications of some sort of giant carrion-feeding subterranean mole with my ravings about canine and simian developments of members, and my absurd insistence on startlingly humanoid cranial development, and brain convolutions indicating a degree of intelligence that... Well, there's no use going into all that now.
Sounds like a Lovecraftian ghoul, the canine features in there.
Sounds like, smells like, looks like. The subway is specifically mentioned in Pickman's model, right in the first paragraph.
Yep.
Why don't you laugh at Oliver's grandfather who won't ride in a motor? If I don't like that damned subway, it's my own business. And then one of Pickman's horrific paintings actually uses the subway as a setting.
Mm-hmm.
We produced a full reading of that story. Greg Johnson on the microphone. Why don't we just listen to that passage?
Gad, how that man could paint. There was a study called Subway Accident, in which a flock of the vile things were clambering up from some unknown catacomb through a crack in the floor of the Boylston Street subway and attacking a crowd of people on the platform.
I think that was likely the passage about the Boston subway that got into Johnson's head and prompted the story. Johnson also said in a memoir that he took some inspiration for the setting from the Twin Peaks tunnel in San Francisco. But let's get back to the story.
When he revealed his findings about the creature that he studied, Craig thought the authorities were going to call him crazy. But instead, they offered him a job with a lot more money. He would be getting paid in a month what he made a year at the museum.
Special subway detail, they called it.
The train derailment was not an accident. The creatures sabotaged the tracks. The police were able to cover up the partially eaten bodies of men, women, and children from the accident, some of which didn't actually die from the wreck. None of the survivors seemed to know what actually happened.
Because they were in complete darkness after the subway crash. They wouldn't have been able to see these creatures. And that to me is the most horrific, that they might have been pinned down or injured and then devoured by ghouls they couldn't see.
Oh, God.
It says the poor devils who were merely injured never knew what charnel horrors were going on in the Stygian depths about them, nor cared, no doubt, in their agony. Even one man who had his arm chewed half off never knew. Surgeons amputated the rest immediately and told him when he regained consciousness that he'd lost it in the wreck. He's still walking the streets today, blissfully ignorant of what almost happened to him that night. A ghoul eats half your arm and you're walking around with no idea?
Wow.
Way to rob you of a cool story.
For the last 20 years, the Special Subway Detail has been patrolling the tunnels and disposing of any threat that it can find. Inspector Craig explains that it was hard going in the early days. They just had lanterns and guns and a hand car, which is one of those things that go on the train tracks where people stand on a platform and they pump it, like in the Buster Keaton movies.
Absolutely.
The special unit was pretty ineffectual at the beginning. These things were tenacious, but they managed to stop them from causing any more big train wrecks. However, there were still incidents. Nothing like the scale of the train wreck, however.
The Special Subway Detail is like an occupying force trying to contain insurgents in a way because, these ghouls didn't ask them to build a subway down there.
No.
New York essentially invaded the underground.
They tried all kinds of ways to combat them, poison gas, dynamiting sections of the tunnels, but it didn't seem to have much of an effect on the creatures. Craig says this, 1,000 times I was tempted to chuck the whole thing, to go back above ground to sunshine and sanity and forget the charnel horrors of this mad Nyarlathotep world far underneath. It's like, what? How the hell is he throwing around Nyarlathotep world? Like everybody knows what he's talking about.
It was really odd. All I can think is that the narrator just let it go the way you do when people are telling you a long story.
Despite wanting to give it up, Craig can't let these things harm innocent people. Think of the children. He also gets real job satisfaction that he didn't get with his museum work. Plus, he can still study these creatures, and that's fun. Craig thinks it's not just a city phenomenon, but a global problem. He mentions how the Bible references ghouls that burrow in the earth and how there are other historical references to something similar to this in Persia, Syria, and Palestine.
There's the Arabian Nights original ghoul source material, but I do think that he's referencing Amina in these comments. The story we covered, which had already previously been published in this magazine. Yeah. He says, even today in modern Persia, they hunt down with dogs and guns, like beasts, strange tomb-dwelling creatures.
In New York, there are historical accounts of Native Americans knowing about these things on Manhattan Island. Even Washington Irving seemed to know about them. In the history of the city of New York, Irving speaks of nocturnal guards on patrol around cemeteries. And here is the Lovecraft name drop.
And then the modern writers, Lord, there's a whole library of them on the subject. One of them, a great student of the subject, had almost as much data on them from his reading as I'd gleaned from my years of study down here. Oh yes, I learned a lot from Lovecraft, and he got a lot from me too. That's where you might call the authenticity came in from some of his yarns that attracted the most attention. Oh, of course he had to soft pedal the strongest parts of it, just as you're going to have to do if you ever mention this in your own writings.
So the narrator is the actual writer of the story?
That means this is all really real.
Oh, no.
What he's doing there is the same as the Trick and Pickman's model, where you find out that's a photograph attached to the painting. Mm-hmm. He's saying there's a photograph attached to that story.
Right. Yeah. And it's also the author kind of giving a little bit of props to the guy that he's getting his stuff from as well.
Yeah.
Craig reveals that they have captured and kept a few of these creatures in the past.
There have been times when it seemed judicious for influential people above ground to realize just how important is the work we're doing down here. So when we have a really stubborn skeptic to our program, we take him in there, hand him a flashlight, and let him train it himself on what was prisoned there in total darkness. And then we'd stand by to catch him as he fainted. Oh, a lot of city officials and politicians have been down here. Why not? They couldn't possibly speak of the experience afterward. They'd just be locked up as lunatics if they did. And it made them much more liberal about funds.
But they couldn't keep these creatures captive for too long because it would make the members of the special unit soul sick just being near these things. So they would kill them.
It's not so much the appearance of the things or even what they eat. We got an unlimited supply of that from the city morgue. And to anyone who spent half his life in dissecting rooms as I have, it might be a lot worse. But there's a sort of cosmic horror the things exude that, it's quite beyond description. You just can't breathe the same air with them, live together in the same sane world.
Craig says that he's written 2 volumes of research on these things, which he will pass on to his successor. He's afraid that the fight will continue long into the future, since eliminating them or this tunnel would destroy $20 million worth of property, and the city would never go for that.
It is a sunken cost fallacy, literally.
Craig is interrupted when the phone rings. There's been an incident, the first in months. Craig wonders aloud if these things do indeed have psychic powers.
They exude cosmic horror, and they know when somebody's gossiping about them.
Just then, a handcar goes whizzing by the window. Riot car number 1, says Craig. It's a souped-up handcar that can go 80 miles an hour.
Wow.
That seems dangerous. Men armed with machine guns have been deployed to the site of the incident. A second rail car has been dispatched to approach from the opposite direction. Craig takes the narrator to the radio so that they can listen in on what's going on. Microphones have been installed every 100 feet or so in the tunnels so they could listen in to all different parts.
It almost seemed like a reference to The Night Wire by H.F. Arnold when he says, you'd be surprised to know what one hears sometimes. But it also sets up the very statement of Randolph Carter, Lovecraftian premise that you're not going to be able to actually see what happens, just hear it and imagine it. So I think that's sort of the second story check here, because that was a ghoul story too, perhaps. I mean, it was the person descending into the earth, and there's some monsters down there, so.
They tune into the microphone located at the incident site, and this creepy sound comes through.
A strange, high tittering, blasphemously off-key that merged into a growl and a moan.
Craig believes the creatures are unaware of the audio surveillance.
The microphones allowed them to know exactly where the ghouls were by hearing them, tunneling up into the tunnel. And then they approach the batch of fiends from opposite sides on the riot cars. This is like, it's not steampunk because it's a little past that era, but it does have a special device feel to it. You know, I can imagine them having belts they would have to strap themselves onto on these riot cars to go 80 miles an hour down the railroad tracks, approaching these ghouls on two sides. They'd have to slow down, otherwise they'd ram into each other. So how scary would that last little bit of slowdown be as you're approaching the ghouls, you know? This is pretty neat cinematically. Of course, our narrator and Inspector Craig don't get to see it. They can only hear it.
The creatures freak out as they hear the two cars approaching, and they realize that they are trapped. The cops use spotlights to blind and burn them, and then begin opening fire with machine guns. They kill them all. While this is going on, Craig gets more animated and aggressive. Describing what sounds they're hearing, Craig's eyes begin to blaze, his body crouches, and his teeth are bared in a snarl.
Yeah, he's really loving this radio program he's hearing. They're trapped. Caught between them, no time to dig, to burrow down into their saving Mother Earth like the vermin they are. Hear 'em yell, hear 'em shriek in agony. That's the lights, you know, blazing searchlights trained on dark, accustomed bodies, burning, searing, withering them like actual blazing heat. And now, he gets really excited listening to all of this mayhem. And the narrator says that he can't look away from the inspector's blazing eyes. I stood regarding him, my mind sickly ticking off details. God, why had I not seen them before? The lengthening of jaw, that flattening of forehead and cranium. No human head could be shaped like that.
Inspector Craig realizes the narrator is studying him, drops into a chair, and covers his face. He confesses to the narrator that the change has been a long time coming. And it's not just him. It's all the members of the special unit, bit by bit. They don't like to go above ground anymore, and the sun is too harsh for them. They're turning into ghouls too. He explains that he gets cravings, charnel desires that would blast your very soul. He knows it will only get worse until he runs off into the tunnels and will be hunted down and killed like the officer he mentioned earlier.
And yet the thing interests me, I'll admit. It interests me scientifically, even though it horrifies my very soul, even though it damns me forever. For it shows how they may have come about, must have come about, in fact, in the world's dim dawn. Perhaps never quite human, of course. Perhaps never Neanderthal or Piltdown. Something even lower, closer linked to the primeval beast. But then when driven underground, into caves, and then beneath them, by man's coming, retrograded, century by uncounted century, down to the worm-haunted darkness. Just as we poor devils are retrograding down here, from very contact with them, until at last none of us will ever be able again to walk above in the blessed sunlit air among our fellow men. With a roar and a howl, the thing was upon us, out of total darkness. Instinctively, I drew back as its headlights passed. Every object in the room rattled from the reverberation. Then the power car was by, and there was only the clackety-clack, clackety-clack of wheels and lighted windows flickering by, like bits of film on a badly connected projection machine. The 415 Express, he said heavily, from the Bronx. Safe and sound, you'll notice. Its occupants all unsuspecting of how they were safeguarded, of how they'll always be safeguarded. But at what cost? At what an awful cost. The 415 Express. That means it's dawn, you know, in the city overhead. Rays of the rising sun are gilding the white skyscrapers of Manhattan. A whole great city begins to wake to morning life. But there's no dawn for us down here, of course. There'll never be a dawn for poor lost souls down here, in the eternal dark. Far, far below.
And that's the end
That's
of this
the end.
tale. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I was glad to be back in that kind of Lovecraftian world. At first, I thought, well, a lot of our listeners, as I said, wrote in and said, you should cover this one. But I thought, well, we just did Amina. I don't want to go back to the ghoul thing. Except This is like an action. It's different.
It is different.
It takes on the same monster, but it's in a different way. And it's that Delta Green feeling of an organized group fighting against these monsters that makes it so cool.
Just the idea that these guys know that it's going to cost them their lives.
Yeah.
And they're still doing it. They're still fighting the good fight, even though it's going to eat them up. And it sounds like pretty quickly, in a couple of years maybe, before they turn into these things.
The predominant theme in it is humans choosing not to reveal or talk about things. And you mentioning that these men are having to go do it even though they're going to die. I mean, that sort of thing does happen in society all the time. I think I was just recently rewatching Chernobyl on HBO, and there were a lot of folks who knew or didn't know that they had to go in there to clean up that site in order to spare Europe, from the radioactivity that would have continued pumping out of that melted down reactor. A lot of people lost their lives or didn't lose them immediately, but knew they'd get cancer within 5 or 6 years because of what they were exposed to. And they did it anyway because somebody had to. Is it good to hold things back from the populace that those monsters are down there? Is it good for them to be protecting everybody mentally?
Yeah, I don't know. That's one of those things where obviously governments do keep secrets, and that's important. But is it? I don't know. What happens if everybody did know about these things?
Right.
And there was a concerted effort by the government. They were able to pull all the resources in to go in and trying to figure out what exactly is going on, what's causing these people to become ghouls, because obviously they're changing as well. So there's some kind of contagion, or if it's magical, then the government should understand that magic is a thing that needs to be dealt with, and that enemies of the state could be using magic to do stuff. Like, it gets really complicated when you open up that can of worms. But I think overall, for the health of a society, it would be good that these things were out there, that knowledge was present so that people could deal with it. Because right now it's not really getting dealt with. It's our emotions. If people just suppress everything that you're feeling, then it's going to come out in terrible ways, and it's going to be unhealthy for your relationships. It's going to be unhealthy for you. But if you get it out, it might be painful initially, sure, but you're going to be able to address the problem because you'll know what it really is. And maybe that's another metaphor that the story is touching on.
I think it definitely is because, there's a societal level of, they have this argument in the original Godzilla movie, actually, in the Diet, in the Congress in Japan. The women are all saying, hey, we got to let everybody know that there's a big monster out there. And the men are going very paternally, no. But they also have a point, which is that if people know they can't do anything, all they'll do is panic and create 20 more problems that we can't handle.
Right.
So there's that aspect of it. But as you say, there's also a personal level. And you have to think at the time the story was written, the idea of suppressing facts was a lot more commonplace in terms of how people were dealt with. So sometimes you'd say you'd have an illness and the doctor wouldn't even tell you that you had it because what are you going to do about it? There was a lot more of, say, if there's something bad going on in your family, not to let other people know about that.
Yeah.
There's a lot more hidden stuff going on as a means of dealing with it. And I think, well, we all feel like we have a right to things, but then when you go to the other extreme and everybody's out in the open about everything and everything's out there and everybody's debating every little thing, how much can you get anything done?
Yeah.
Are you able to process all of that? And I think about just more the practical thing about this. They're fighting ghouls in the sewer tunnels or in the tunnels of the subway. But I think about all the stuff that happens in my home, the water that comes out of the faucet, the waste that I flush down the toilet. Once it exits the house, do I really want to know what creatures are down there interacting with it? Do you really want to know what exactly is happening in the kitchen of the restaurant you just ate at?
Yeah, that's true. I could see that.
Because they're fighting vermin back there, too. Do you want to see the rats that they killed before they made you your pasta? Like, there's a certain amount of don't show me everything because I just want to enjoy my life.
Pfeiffer?
Well, hey, if you've ever worked in food service on any level, you know that there's a battle being fought back there.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things that we choose not to know about, is all I'm saying, which is the long discussion that we've been having on this show. What can you handle and what can't you handle? What should you know and what's blissful ignorance? And this story takes that head on. This also quite rightly, aside from other things it takes from Lovecraft's original, takes us becoming what we beheld. That fear. That you're going to become a ghoul just by being in contact with them, which is a little different than, say, the xenophobic fears that are present in Shadow over Innsmouth, where it's that I'm related, this is in my DNA, this is a contagion from my heritage. This is a little more like if I'm just around these people too long, I'm going to start acting like them, which is that anxiety that folks have about immigrants or a change in culture infecting them.
Yeah, but also you become the thing that you hate, or you become the thing that you're fighting. You know, like you go to war and you're like, oh, these people are bad people. And then you start doing all these bad things yourself. And you're like, oh, I'm not any better than them. In fact, I am one of them.
I always find it interesting, and there are some things that I think you could construe as racist in this story. I think it's a voice of the time trying to characterize the city, but it's not necessarily in a pejorative way.
I don't think so.
But even so, I find it interesting that we do have writers who are maybe racist or xenophobic or whatever, using that to fuel the horror, but you can't help it. The horror at the end does make you humanize the other. Right. Because in Shadow over Innsmouth, you know, he's like, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to be a deep one and swim around in the ocean. By the end of it, the narrator's into it. Yeah. And here, this narrator seems to be kind of getting into being a ghoul too, despite himself.
Right.
And I think there's like this message of assimilation, of inclusion they're accidentally promoting without meaning to. Because inevitably, from a story like this, you take away that if you hang out with this group long enough, you'll pick up their habits, you'll get to understand them, you'll see that they're just like you in so many ways. Yeah. This is just this ancient fear that's in our DNA that probably comes from the fact that there were other species like humans that we shared a common ancestor with that we beat. I mean, there were many of these, right? It's not just Neanderthal. There were other offshoots. So we're always on the lookout for those people showing up again because they're our old enemy, which is, I think, why there's all these worms of the earth, ancient species. We're worried about it in our DNA, you know. And this tackled all that stuff. So for fans of Lovecraft or this genre, this is a ace story, and I can see why it won.
Yes, is great.
The Weird Tales poll that they had. I couldn't find the actual poll or the voting, so I can't really cite the actual source of that vote that this has the reputation for. But regardless, check it out. What about that reader, huh?
I'd like to thank Rick Sandage. Again, please check him out on his podcast, Find the Path Podcast. It's all about Pathfinder RPG gaming. It's lots of fun, so check that out. And thank you for such a great reading.
Thank you, Rick. Really appreciate it. I want to thank our stakers who make these free shows possible. And I'm going to start by thanking the king of all the snakes.
I'd like to thank Crypto Cryptographer.
Alistair Brooks, thank you.
The Twins, thank you.
Christopher Rosser, thank you so much.
Boss Coffee, thank you.
John Morgan, thank you so much.
Angelina Brown, thank you.
Good old handsome Eric Gordon, thank you.
And the delightful Eric S. Vallone, MD, thank you.
Richard Wolf, thank you.
And lastly, Bene, you're a treasure.
Those are the stakers that bring these free shows to you. If you tune in on Patreon, we've got more stories coming up this month. Follow us on our social media to get more details. Hope you'll join us there on Patreon. For now, I am Chad Pfeiffer.
I'm Chris Lack, and you've been listening to Strange Studies of Strange Stories
at strangestudies.com.
Strange Studies of Strange Stories.